got a lot of problems. But one problem we do not need and should not accept for a moment is another country actively interfering in our electoral process. And that clearly is what Russia did. What is being investigated as we speak by the intelligence committees in the Senate and in the House is, A, we know that Russia intervened in the election. That is not in dispute. What we don't know is the degree, if any, of active collusion on the part of the Trump campaign and Russia. We know that certainly over the years, a number of people associated with Trump know a lot of people in Russia, have contacts with people in Russia. Trump himself claims to be a friend of Putin's, etc., etc. What we don't have now is definitive proof that Trump's campaign actively colluded with the Russians in the presidential election. That has to be explored. And if it, and I say if, it turns out to be true, this is a huge issue that the United States Congress must deal with in the strongest possible way.
I think it's important for people to understand we are in a new battle of ideas with Russia. It's not communism versus capitalism anymore, but it is democracy and representative government versus autocracy and authoritarianism. Around the world we see autocracy really on the march. We see it obviously in Moscow, where Putin is in the vanguard of this movement, but we see it in places like Poland and in Hungary and the party of Marine Le Pen in France, in the opposition to Angela Merkel in Germany. The same kind of assault that we had on our democracy in our election, the Russians are using against Europe in their elections. And in a very real respect, the fate of liberal democracy is at risk. There are those that want to tear down the whole idea of democracy and democratic institutions. Part of the Russian storyline is, okay, in Russia, we're not really a democracy anymore. We're kind of a kleptocracy, a thugocracy. But so is the United States. It's just that the U.S. are hypocrites about it. And so when the President of the United States is interviewed with Bill O'Reilly, and he says,
do you respect Putin?
I do respect him.
Do you? Why? Putin's a killer.
A lot of killers. We got a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
And the President of the United States says, well, are we really all that different? This is exactly what the Kremlin wants to hear. This is exactly the story they want to tell, that essentially there is no such thing really as democracy. Every government is corrupt, and therefore our model offers as much as any other. That, I think, Americans ought to be deeply concerned about.
Putin and Russia interfered with our democratic process. That is at this point undisputed. They had a favored candidate in the presidential race, and that happens to be Donald Trump, who is now sitting in the White House.
This is more about the future than it is about the past. One of the conclusions that the intelligence community reached is that this was not a one-off by Putin and the Russians. Their hacking and their dumping of documents in our election will take place again. The Russians will do this again. So we need to understand exactly what the Russians did to us, not as a way of relitigating the election, I think, as the President likes to suggest, but rather so that we can understand how we must defend ourselves.
I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican, male, female, black, white. It does not matter. Every American should be concerned about what happened in this. Russia and Vladimir Putin tried to interfere with our democratic process. And what's worse is they will continue to try to interfere with our process unless we get to the bottom of this. It's why I'm calling for, and the vast majority of my Democratic colleagues are calling for, an independent 9/11 style commission to get to the bottom of this. Why any Republican, unless they're afraid of something, would want to interfere with that process is beyond me. This is something that literally our very democracy is at stake, and we need to make sure that we get to the bottom of it.